An elderly man, John Miller, is stopped at the gates of Arlington during General Wallace's funeral. Guards dismiss him as a trespasser until a small, tarnished pin on his lapel, shrapnel turned into a token by Wallace, reveals he's the legendary Shepherd, a covert rescuer who saved Wallace and others in Vietnam. A four-star general halts the ceremony, salutes John publicly, rebukes the guards, and escorts him to the front. The incident becomes the basis of a military training ethos, the Miller Protocol. Later, the humbled lieutenant quietly thanks John. The story's theme: true valor is often invisible. The line of mourners moved like a black ribbon along the white stone. Wind combed the hills and made the flags breathe. At the service road gate, a hand came up, palm out, stop. John Miller stopped. He wore his only suit, pressed by hotel iron. The cuffs were tired, the shoes clean and old. He stood with his hat in his hand the way people used to stand when they were asking to come inside a church. "Sir, this entrance is secured." The young guard's tone was polite wood. Training speaking through a hard jaw. His badge shone, his eyes did not. John looked past him. Across the slope, rows and rows of names that didn't need introductions. He'd learned long ago to let silence do the talking. Today it had to. A second guard drifted closer, boots crunching grit. "Private event," he said, glancing at the procession of dark cars. "General Wallace. If you're looking for the public, I'm looking for him." John's voice was sanded smooth. No edge. No apology. The first guard's look flicked to John's empty lapel, finding nothing the eye could count, no bars, no ribbons. Credentials? John touched the brim of his hat, thought of the letter he didn't have, the medals he never wanted. He lifted his gaze to the hillside. "Tell him John Miller came." A lieutenant appeared from the checkpoint shade, all straight lines and fresh confidence, clipboard tucked like a rank. He took in the scene at a glance and made it a problem to solve. "What's the issue?" he asked, not really asking. "Won't clear the gate, sir." Claims he knew the general. The word claims did more work than it needed to. The lieutenant faced John as if measuring him for a policy. "Sir, we're minutes out. I need you to use the public entrance. This road is restricted." John nodded, once. "I'll wait here." "That's not an option." The lieutenant's smile had the friendliness of a locked door. "Please step aside." Wind lifted the hem of John's jacket. A small, dull pin sat crooked on the lapel, warped metal, the color of old rain. It didn't catch light. It absorbed it. The lieutenant's eyes snagged on it. "What's that?" He reached, quick and thoughtless, the way one flicks lint from a sleeve. John's hand rose slow, warning, but not quick enough. Finger met metal. Sound fell away. Rain. Not wind, rain, hot and animal, drumming on broad leaves. The ground a sucking mouth. The air exploded with steel. Voices yanked raw. A tree cracked like a rifle and fell across a man trying not to cry out. John, a young face. Mud where a mustache would grow. Hands slipping on blood. Then it was gone. The guard's nail clicked on the pin and came back. He blinked, uncomprehending. The world reassembled, the white stones, the wind, the line of cars. John took a careful breath. "Don't," he said, not loud. The kind of don't that came from someone who had walked with consequences. The lieutenant swiveled to authority. "Escort him to the outer lot," he said. "Now, please." Hands closed on John's sleeves. He did not resist. He had learned that resistance wastes breath meant for later. Down the road, tires whispered. In the distance, a captain in dress blues watched the scene with a discomfort that did not look away. Captain Hayes had been taught to scan for patterns that didn't fit, a bulge where a bulge shouldn't be, a car parked wrong, a face too still. The old man at the gate was still, but not with fear. He wore stillness like a tool. When the guards took his arms, something in Hayes' chest tightened. Not anger. Recognition. He stepped back from the cordon and pulled out his phone, moving with the careful choreography of not making something worse. "Markinson," he whispered into the receiver. Static. Then a voice hurried, clipped. "Go." "Sir, Hayes." "Main gate. We've got an elderly civilian being detained. Says he knew General Wallace. Name given, John Miller. Security will handle, the colonel said, paper crackling in the background, the noise of schedules about to start. We're wheels up in 5. Hayes swallowed. He was not a man given to mystical nonsense. He believed in simple things done well. But the pin had lit up the bottom of his memory like a flare. Sir, he's wearing it looks like shrapnel, fashioned into a pin. Silence. A different kind of radio quiet. Hayes had heard it once on a route clearance, when a voice halfway through a joke cut out and nothing came back but breath. Say the name again, Markinson said. John Miller, sir. The line died. At the gate, the lieutenant felt the ceremony move around him like a machine, its gears clicking into place. The program in his head left no space for improvisation. He was young enough to believe procedures would keep him safe from mistakes. He nodded at the guards. Let's go. John repositioned his footing to avoid being pulled off balance. He had been dragged before. Young hands were strong and careless. He didn't take it personally. The pin pressed into his chest as he moved. Memory walked beside him, pace for pace, refusing to be left. Keep this, a voice had rasped once, the jungle night a lid on the world. It's ugly, but it's yours. Metal warm from a body it shouldn't have been in. Hands that shook, not from fear, from fatigue the marrow could feel. A ripple passed through the gathered mourners, heads turning toward a growing murmur. Engines, but wrong. Not the hearse's solemn hum. Urgency. A sedan door slammed. A major jogged up, out of breath, holding a handset extended like a torch. Sir, he called toward the stand where generals gathered in constellation. Colonel Markinson declaring he hesitated, as if saying it might summon something, code Shepherd. The word ran ahead of him, carried on breath and rumor. Shepherd. Some shook their heads. A few glanced at one another with eyebrows that said stories you're not supposed to tell out loud. The lieutenant's half-smile faltered. He was not stupid. He could read a room when it changed temperature. Hold, he said, voice tightening. The guards stopped walking John. For a beat, the cemetery didn't move. Even the flags seemed to listen. Down the service road, black SUVs crested the rise, dark and fast, moving like a decision already made. The sound of gravel under hard braking felt like an order. Stay here, the lieutenant told the guards, and to John, he added the 2 words people use when they don't know who they're talking to. Sir, please. John looked at him, and, for the first time, met his eyes. Whatever the lieutenant saw there made him swallow. The doors opened in a choreography of polished shoes and ribbons. Colonel Markinson's face carried the look of a man who had misplaced something sacred and then found it in a pawnshop window. Behind him came General Peters, and with him, the air shifted from weather to weathered authority. The lieutenant straightened without being told. He could feel his own heartbeat in his collar. Hayes exhaled. He hadn't known he was holding it. General Peters didn't waste steps. He walked through the gate as if walls were suggestions. Eyes forward, spine a line drawn with a ruler. He didn't look left or right until he was 3 paces from John. He stopped. The moment pressed in, padded by the hush of hundreds. Then he lifted his hand. The salute was not for show. It had weight. It reached back through decades and touched a night most had never known. The chapel hush broke into a whisper that tried to become a question and failed. Mr. Miller, Peters said, voice carrying without shout. Sir. The lieutenant felt his face heat, then drain. He was a good student. He knew when he'd answered in the wrong book. He started to speak, apology forming, explanations scrambling for purchase, but Peter's eyes cut over and froze words mid-birth. Stand at ease, the general said to everyone and no one. The posture of the entire hill loosened a notch. He turned back to John and, for a breath, the rank fell away. 2 men, both past the age where pain is theoretical, stood in a corridor made of attention. Peter's gaze drifted to the pin. Close. The metal was uglier, pitted, asymmetrical, the edge a little sharp, as if it still remembered what it had been. The general nodded once, more to himself than to anyone else. He stepped aside, leaving a line of sight from John to the gathered officers. He spoke simply, like a man reciting names. In the spring of '68, he said, a team went down. Jungle so thick you had to move the air before you could move your feet. No way in. No way out. He didn't tell it all. He didn't have to. He let a few details do the lifting. A medic who wasn't supposed to be there became a map. A pilot who wasn't supposed to fly that night became weather. A man who refused rank carried 12 men's years on his back. The words landed. Not sermon. Inventory. Peters nodded toward John without gesturing like a tour guide. You're looking at him. The line between myth and skin dissolved with the simplest grammar. The lieutenant's jaw worked. His training offered scripts for disorder, not for reverence. His gaze slid to the pin, and something like comprehension broke over his face, late, clumsy, honest. He stepped forward, then checked himself, unsure where to stand. He ended up beside his own men, smaller somehow. Colonel Markinson approached John with a tightness around his eyes. Sir, he said quietly, I should have been at that gate. That's on me. John's mouth made the shape of an answer. You were where you needed to be. Peter's voice came back, one more sentence tucked in. General Wallace wrote a line for a day like this. If a man named John Miller arrives, he said, move heaven. We couldn't move it fast enough. Wind lifted the flags again, as if the hill had finally exhaled. Hayes watched the lieutenant. The younger man's throat worked. His hands, for once, had nothing to hold. Hayes felt a small knot inside him loosen, because understanding is also a kind of discipline. Escort Mr. Miller to the family, Peters said, but his feet were already moving to do it himself. The path opened. Not because of orders. Because people decided to make space. They walked slow, not because age insists, but because the moment required it. White markers rose around them like a forest of quiet. From the front row, faces turned grief-soft, lines etched in long marriages to service. A woman, Wallace's daughter, Hayes guessed from the photos in the program, stood. Tears made her eyes brighter, not smaller. She reached for John's hand with both of hers as if catching a lifeline that had been thrown 50 years ago. You gave him back to us, she whispered. We used those years. John nodded, the motion careful, as if anything more would spill something precious. He used them, he said. Peters guided John to a seat. The family compressed, making room without calculation. The general stepped back, taking a place that was not his by rank but felt correct by rightness. The chaplain began, voice measured, the ritual words holding. Names of campaigns and commands were read, but in the spaces between, other things lived. A laugh that boomed across tents, a letter that arrived on a birthday it had no business finding. Behind the first row, the lieutenant stood at the aisle, not trusting himself to sit. His uniform felt heavier by a pound that had nothing to do with cloth. He looked at his men, at the captain who had made the call, at the colonel who'd moved the earth. He made himself look at John. The pin glinted, not bright, but persistent. A nail in a board that holds. During the honors rifles, taps, memories rose like breath and cold. John let them. He did not fight them anymore. He watched the flag fold into a triangle. He watched hands that practiced until muscle remembered how to be sacred. Peters leaned to Markinson. We fix this, he murmured. We will, Markinson said, eyes on the lieutenant. Not their careers, Peters added. Their lenses. Markinson's mouth tugged. A course. A habit, Peters said. We'll call it a course. We'll make them practice seeing. The chaplain finished. The family stood. People moved the way people move when a knot of sorrow has loosened just enough to allow motion. John remained seated a moment longer, letting the sound of taps fade the rest of the way out of his bones. He rose. The world wavered, the normal little wobble of age, and righted. Hayes was suddenly at his elbow, not grabbing, present. John gave him a small nod that said both I noticed, and that's enough. At the edge of the chairs, the lieutenant stood straight, hat under his arm, eyes unsure where to land. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. Sir, he said to John, the word now simple. I misread you. John considered him the way you consider a road, where it's going, how it bends. You read what you were taught to read. The lieutenant's lips pressed together. He took that in like medicine. Learn new, John said, and his mouth warmed into the ghost of a smile. Faster than I did. It was quiet, but it landed. Peters, a few steps away, heard it and didn't add anything. Command is often knowing when silence is the rank you wear. After the service, the family invited John to the casket. The wood gleamed dark, the kind that holds reflections, not glare. John placed his palm on it like a blessing he wasn't ordained to give and had given anyway many times, in places without roofs. "Dave," he said, not loudly. He could say the first name now, rank had retired. "You always owed me a beer." A small tremor in his hand eased. He slid his fingers to his lapel and touched the pin. The room tilted, time-making space, not a vision that stole the present, but a braid that allowed both. Canvas flapped. A lantern hissed. The field hospital smelled like bleach that had lost the fight. Wallace sat on the next cot, sweat-salted, trying to look like a Captain Felt. He held up the jagged metal, cleaned as best he could with someone else's water. "Regulations don't have a drawer for you," Wallace said, voice rough. "So I made one." He pressed the thing into John's hand. "Don't lose it. If you do, I'll make another." He grinned and winced. "Make you sit still to take it out again." John had laughed then, a single exhale, because breath was expensive. Back at the casket, John let his fingers fall. He turned and found Peters watching with the kind of attention that honors privacy by not looking too long. Peters straightened, and when he spoke, the valley caught it without echo. "Detail," he called softly. "Present, arms." The line of uniforms drew rifles to the exact angle that turns posture into promise. The salute rolled like a wave made of steel and habit. Peters faced John. "We failed at the gate," he said. "That's on me." John shook his head. "You came late." "Alive," John said, and the word landed like a verdict and a mercy. Peters breathed out. He reached and, without touching the pin, gestured to it. "May I tell them?" he asked, not needing the permission and needing it anyway. John nodded once. Peters turned to the assembled soldiers and civilians, close enough to see faces, far enough to carry. He kept it short. "That pin is not a trinket," he said. "It's a promise kept. It cost blood that wasn't his. It stands for a night most of us only know because men like him." He let his eyes find Hayes, then the lieutenant, then back to John brought the morning. No flourish. No legend polished to squeak. Just a plank laid across a gap and an invitation to step. He turned back, and in front of everyone, he saluted John again. Not for ceremony. For closure. The sound that followed was not sound. It was felt, the collective shift of people understanding something at the same time. A few hands rose in salute on their own. Others placed palms over hearts with a sincerity that didn't ask permission. John bowed his head, not to deflect the honor, but to aim it toward the hill. "Every stone," he murmured, almost to himself. Hayes heard and answered quietly, as if agreeing with a prayer. "Every stone." They named the course 6 weeks later, though the work started the next morning. Slides were built, then cut in half. The first draft had too many words and not enough faces. Peters red-penned the phrase "human terrain" and wrote in the margin, "people." They called it the Miller Protocol because someone suggested it and everyone realized there wasn't a better name. It wasn't a checklist, it was a practice: pause, observe, consider context, ask one more question than you think you need. It might not save the day. It might save a person. The lieutenant sat through the first pilot class, in the front row by choice. He took notes like a man trying to write smaller than his regrets. When the instructor clicked to a photograph of a pin, blurry, tarnished, he didn't flinch. He raised his hand. "What do we do when we're wrong?" he asked. The instructor considered. "Start sooner next time," she said. "And say sorry like you mean it." He nodded. He would. Autumn came soft. The air traded heat for distance. On a Tuesday that had made up its mind to rain, the lieutenant ducked into a diner on the edge of a different base, where the coffee tasted like the color brown. The bell chimed. An old man took the end stool and ordered without looking at the menu. The lieutenant knew the back of that head now. He'd been living with it in his thoughts. He didn't rehearse. He didn't draft a speech on the napkin beside his spoon. He walked over, slid a bill under the cup as the waitress set it down. "For the coffee," he said, not trusting himself with more and needing more anyway. He swallowed. And for he didn't know the noun. Rescue wasn't his. Lesson felt too tidy. He settled on the smallest true thing. For your time. John looked up. He took in the uniform, the eyes, the way the young man's shoulders had room where the armor had been. Recognition wasn't the point. Recognition came anyway. Sit, John said. The lieutenant sat. They didn't talk about that day. They talked about the rain and how roads flood where they always flood. They talked about boots that never quite dry, and about a mechanic who could listen to an engine and tell you its secrets. When the cup was half empty, John said, "You did your job." "Badly," the lieutenant said. "Differently next time," John corrected. "That's the job, too." Outside, a truck hissed past. The bell chimed again. The world did what it always does, kept moving. They stood. The lieutenant offered a handshake. John took it, then put his other hand over it, a small lay-on of gratitude. "Stay safe, son," John said. It wasn't a wish. It was a benediction. The lieutenant stepped into the rain. He didn't put his hat on. He let the water find him and didn't rush. The base looked the same. It felt altered by a degree you could only measure over miles. Back at Arlington, wind ran its fingers over the hill. If you stood very still, you could hear the small sounds of a place that remembers for a living, leaves talking to stone, flags exhaling. Somewhere under a jacket that had been through too many presses, a crooked pin rested against a ribcage, still ugly, still perfect. Not all invitations are printed. Not all doors need keys. Sometimes the right person arrives, and the world, late or not, opens.